start with committee introductions, starting on my far right with Representative Sanderson.
Thank you. Good morning. I'm Deb Sanderson. I represent District 88, which is Chelsea, Whitefield, Jefferson, and part of Noblesboro.
Good morning. I'm Amy Dropfield. I represent House District 18, which is part of the city of St. Paul.
And good morning. I'm Chuck Kruger, the House Chair, representing District 92, St. George, Thomaston, South Thomaston, Cushing, Matinicus, and Cree Haven, and welcome all.
Bob Duchesne, House District 121, which is Elton, Argyle, Hudson, Corinth, and Milford.
Good morning. My name is Paul Davis, and I represent Senate District 4, which is parts of Somerset and Penobscot and all of Piscataquis, which currently is in the autumn glory. I urge you to come up and see some beauty.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Bill Diamond, Senator from District 26. My Senate district includes Wyndham, Raymond, Casco, Standish, Baldwin, and Fly Island.
And good morning, I'm Mike McClellan. I live in Raymond, Maine, with all our neighbors, and I'm the House Rep for House Seat 66, which is parts of Raymond, Casco, and Poland.
Good morning, I'm Stan Grzowski, State Senator, District 24, which we all know is beautiful downtown in scenic Brunswick, the rolling hills of Panhandle, the working waterfront community of Hartsville, and the shopping and natural resource mecca of Freeport, and recently added North Yarmouth. Thank you.
Thank you, Senator. And Senator?
Senator Chris Johnson, representing lovely part of the mid-coast. I think we're in peak color right now, and the fog and over the still waters, beautiful. Lincoln County, all the towns except Dresden, and adding the towns of Windsor and Washington.
Thank you. My name is Roger Caton. I represent Augusta and some surrounding communities here in Senate District 15. And welcome to all of you who've dodged through the traffic, the rush hour traffic to get here today. Glad you're here. So Chairman Kruger and I have talked about this. We're just going to set out how we're going to proceed today so everybody knows what we're up to and how we plan to conduct the day. So back on July 1st, this committee charged OPEGA, the Oversight, the Office of Program Evaluation and Governmental Accountability, to determine the facts associated with alleged proposed changes to the state's fiscal year 2016 and 2017 Department of Education funding for will-hinckley and the impact of those proposed changes to the school. And that's the scope of the review we asked OPEGA to conduct, and that's exactly what they did. And they prepared a report, which is called an information brief, and that report was presented to us by Executive Director Ashcroft back on September 8th. At that time, we had an opportunity to ask staff, specifically Beth, questions, and we then set this matter for public hearing. Our purpose of being here today, just as we do in every single review that we conduct. As we often do, we asked several people to appear before us this morning to answer committee questions. We asked 4 people, 4 invitations, to people who played some significant role in the events which led us here today. The first request was to Cynthia Montgomery, the governor's attorney. She has declined to appear, citing as a reason the pending lawsuit brought by Speaker Reeves against the governor. She has, however, supplied some written information which Beth will tell us about in a minute. The second invitation we issued was to Aaron Chadbourne, a senior policy advisor to the governor. Mr. Chadbourne has also declined to appear, citing the same reasons as Ms. Montgomery. We also invited Tom Desjardins, the acting commissioner of the Department of Education. Mr. Desjardins expressed a willingness to appear, but he is legitimately unable to do so because of a medical issue. He did express a willingness to answer questions in writing, which we did not get to him in time, but he has submitted a letter to the committee, which is now in our file. The fourth individual we asked to appear is Jack Moore, the chairman of the board of will-hinckley. I understand Mr. Moore agreed to be here and is with us this morning. So here's how we plan to conduct the hearing going forward this morning. First, we're going to ask Beth to provide us with some additional information which has come in since our September 8th meeting. Then we will invite Mr. Moore to join us to make any statement he wishes and also to answer questions which members of the committee might have. After that, we're going to open up the hearing to public comment. First, we're going to ask for if there's anybody here who has had actually direct involvement in any of the issues which led us here, and then generally members of the public. We want to hear from anyone with respect to the information they may have that they believe is relevant to our inquiry, and any comments they might have or suggestions they might have for the committee on anything else we should do or any further actions you think we should take. At the end of the public hearing, we'll go into a work session to determine what, if any, further steps the committee may wish to take based upon everything we have learned today. I'd like to make 3 points before we begin. Number one, this public hearing is following exactly the same process we follow in every single review, and we're following it here. Second, I want to reiterate the goal that all 12 of us on this committee have, which is just to get all the facts up. We are a fact-finding committee at this point. That's what we've been doing, and that's what we're doing today. And third, I'd like to remind everyone that the scope of this review is fairly limited, as I said out before. I think it's helpful to remind everyone that this hearing is not about other matters that might or might not involve the governor. Accordingly, we will ask anyone who wishes to speak to try to confine your remarks to the scope of this particular review. Having said that, this is a public hearing. We're here to do the work of the public, and we want to hear from you, and welcome each and every person who took the time to get here. So first, we're going to ask Beth to bring us up to date on some other information which may have come forward since our September 8th meeting.
Good morning.
Good morning.
Beth Ashcroft, Director of the Office of Program Evaluation and Government Accountability. Committee members had several questions at the September 8th meeting that I have put together responses to the degree that I was able. That document is behind tab 2 in your meeting materials, and I will just run down through those questions and responses with you to start with so that you have that information. The first question had to do with understanding how big a part of will-hinckley the Means Charter School actually was, and so we sent off a question to will-hinckley asking them to explain that to us in terms of what percentage of the budget for both revenues and expenses the Means School represented for will-hinckley, what percentage of the students, etc., were served, were attending Means School. So will-hinckley did provide information on that, which is on page 1 of that document. will-hinckley's budget for the current year is about $5.2 million. The Means part of that budget is about $1.6 million, or 31% of the total, and that's the expenditure budget. Means is budgeted to bring in about $1.4 million in revenue, and that leaves a shortfall between its budgeted revenues and expenses of about $233,000 that will-hinckley covers and has been covering to about that same level since Means was established. will-hinckley currently has 156 students on campus, with 124 of them, or 79%, being students of the Means School. And we also asked for what percentage of the staff at will-hinckley were working at the Means School. That number was a little bit more difficult for will-hinckley to give us a specific percentage on, because there are shared staff between will-hinckley and the Means School. But a quick estimate they gave us is that 40 to 50% of the total will-hinckley staff is allocated to Means. Another question the committee had was whether the $530,000 in funding for will-hinckley was part of the governor's line item veto of the budget that occurred. Based on our discussions with the Office of Fiscal and Program Review, it's our understanding that the $530,000 for will-hinckley would not have been affected by the governor's line item vetoes. The governor did line item veto all the proposed increase in the General Purpose Aid for Local Schools program, which included both his own proposed increases as well as the additional $19.5 million the legislature had added to that program. And while the will-hinckley funding, which is the Center of Excellence funding, is captured under the GPA program, no increases had been proposed for that funding line. The $530,000 was the same as it had been in previous years, and so technically that was not vetoed. The committee also asked if we could obtain for them a copy of the June 18th letter from the Harold Alfond Foundation to Goodwill-Hinckley Board Chair Jack Moore. We did speak with the Harold Alfond Foundation, and they were willing to allow us to share that letter with you, and it is attached to your response document there. We were also asked again about providing the handwritten note from the governor to the Goodwill-Hinckley Board Chair. I will remind the committee, OPEGA did request categories of documents from Goodwill-Hinckley that would have included the handwritten note. We also specifically asked the board chair to provide the handwritten note. He told us he no longer has the note. We also requested categories of documents from the governor's office that would have included any copy of the handwritten note that the governor may have kept. The governor's office declined to provide any documents to us beyond what they had already released in response to a FOIA request, citing the pending lawsuit against the governor. A copy of the handwritten note was not among the documents the governor's office provided. We did follow up. I did follow up with questions to Cindy Montgomery specifically, asking, because they had offered to answer questions in writing. So I did jump the gun a little bit and did ask whether she could confirm whether there was a handwritten note that the governor sent and whether or not the governor had a copy of that. Her responses are that the governor has indicated that he did send a personal note to Chair Moore, but the governor's office does not have any copies of the personal note sent to Mr. Moore. We were also asked whether the June 28th video from WMTW, which we had mentioned in our brief, had the governor admitting to threatening the funding for Goodwill-Hinckley, whether that was available for the committee. I did send the committee the link to that video online. In addition to that, though, OPEGA also has an audio clip of the actual interview of reporters Peter Merrill and Mal Leary with the governor. That is a little bit beyond what the video provides, and we did provide you a written transcript of that audio clip in your file so you could see what the actual questions and responses were. Lastly, you had, not lastly, but you also had questions about details about the feedback and the pulling of donations that Goodwill-Hinckley had experienced. Chair Moore has been advised that that's a question that the committee has, and I hope is going to be able to respond to that for you. And lastly, you had asked for a copy of the Ethics Commission letter to Speaker Eves. A copy of that letter is also attached to this document. In addition to those questions, you had tapped OPEGA with conducting an interview with Mr. Brown, since we did not reach out and interview him during our process, primarily because we felt it was more valid to learn from the others at Goodwill-Hinckley what role he had played than to necessarily hear it directly from him. And we did feel that we got a very good sense of that, both from other board members that we spoke with, as well as Goodwill-Hinckley management staff. We also could see what Mr. Brown's involvement was by virtue of reviewing the recruitment and selection documentation that Goodwill-Hinckley gave us access to. Nonetheless, we did interview Mr. Brown. His description of his role in the recruitment and selection process is consistent with what we learned from other people. He did review and prioritize all of the 19 applications that were received to determine who should be interviewed. He did not make any comment on whether Speaker Eves should be interviewed or not. He did participate in all the telephone interviews with 5 of the candidates. He did not participate in the telephone interview with Speaker Eves. He also recused himself at any point when a decision was to be made or an interview was to be conducted involving anyone he knew that was an applicant. He was present at the board meetings with both candidates, but his role was only to open and preside over the meeting. He characterized the Means board as guests, and the Goodwill-Hinckley board did the voting. He did participate in the May 13th informal meeting that Chairman Moore arranged, in Brunswick with the top 2 candidates. The Means board felt it was important to have a representative of their board at that meeting since it was a departure from the process that had been laid out. No one else from the Means board was available, so he went. He said the discussion with each candidate was different, but generally the purpose of those meetings was to discuss questions they felt that had not been completely addressed in the interviews up to that point. And for Speaker Eves, his recollection that the primary questions were in regard to his future ambitions. We did talk with him also about whether he had a role. We had learned that he had a role in making Speaker Eves aware of this employment opportunity to start with, and he did say that the former president of will-hinckley had approached him and asked him specifically to relay to Speaker Eves that this opening was available and that he might have interest. He did not play any role in determining whether the Speaker's contract should be terminated. That again was a vote of the will-hinckley board. And I think that is the crux of the information that we gleaned from this interview that I thought would be relevant to your questions. Oh, we did ask him whether there were any points in the process where he spoke with other board members about Speaker Eves as a candidate. He does not recall having any conversations of that nature with board members. So that is the summary of that.
Does anyone have any questions for that based upon what we just heard? Seeing none,
So then to address the folks that you asked to come speak with you today, there is a letter from Ms. Montgomery in your materials today. It's the final document behind tab 2. As you mentioned, Senator Cate, both she and Aaron Chadbourne declined to come today, citing the lawsuit. They did, however, offer to attempt to respond to the committee's any written questions the committee had. She does indicate that in doing so, they will be seeking legal advice on their responses, but nonetheless, the offer is there. So that's in your packet. Commissioner Desjardins did also submit some written comments for you, anticipating what some of your questions might be. His letter addressed to you, Senator Cate, is behind the yellow sheet under tab 2. He is essentially providing what he feels is important background for the committee around his decision to withhold the payment for will-hinckley, that first quarter payment. He cites the fact that the state budget had not yet been enacted, that there was no written agreement in place governing the use of the funds for state funds for will-hinckley at that time. That will-hinckley stated it had no immediate need for the funds. That DOE still was in a position where it was going to have to cut $1.5 million from the cost category that included the Center for Excellence. So those are points that he's making in this letter. He also anticipated something that wasn't in the letter that he called me about later. He also anticipated that you might have a question about why the 2 payments for the other schools went forward, the ones that were on the same payment schedule as will-hinckley, when will-hinckley's did not. His explanation is that he was unaware at the time that the will-hinckley payment was held, that the checks for these other 2 schools were also in progress. The director of school finance for DOE didn't happen to mention those particular payments. He also wanted to make the point that those 2 schools are somewhat different than will-hinckley in that they are state-run, state-owned schools, and that there is a statutory requirement in place to fund those schools. There's no statutory requirement to provide funding for will-hinckley. So that's his explanation as to why those checks weren't held.
questions for Beth based on that? Senator Diamond.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I just had a clarification back to the handwritten note when you inquired from the governor's office. Did they say they just didn't have it or were not going to produce it?
The exact response was the governor's office does not have any copies of the personal note to Mr. McCarthy.
Beth, I have a question about the acting commissioner discharging letter of October 13th, which we now have, in which he sets out the reasons why this funding was held up, justification for that. And I know in reviewing the report that there was some discussion about staff interviews with commissioner discharging, in which he had talked about this very same issue. It seems as though the letter seems to add additional reasons which were not disclosed earlier. Is that a fair statement? And can you kind of summarize that for us?
Sure. From my perspective, many of these points in here were not something that we understood was part of the commissioner's thinking process at the time he made the decision. In our first interview with the commissioner, he indicated that he was talking with the lead team about the fact that this issue was arising between the governor and the speaker. He says he didn't mention anything about will-hinckley funding, but the director of finance offered the fact that the payment was in process and should she hold it. He indicated to us in that interview that it was after that decision, as he was later thinking about the decision that he made, that he started to feel like that was really the best decision to have made because the budget was not enacted yet and they still had $1.5 million that they had to find, and et cetera. So he did indicate in our interviews that the budget situation was part of this, although it seemed to us quite clearly that that came as sort of an afterthought about why his decision made sense. But to point number 2 about there being no written agreement in place governing the use of the funds, we observed in the work that we did that it did not appear that this was discovered, that there was no written contract or the written contract had expired until after the payment was held and DOE started researching, hey, what's been going on with will-hinckley these years, or at least maybe between June 5th and June 9th. But it's not like they knew right away that they had a contract issue. He says will-hinckley stated that it had no immediate needs for the funds. He quotes the Ethics Commission letter. That was on June 11th. That was 2 days after he made the decision. So while it is context around whether it was a sound decision to withhold the payment, it's not something that was part of his decision-making at the time. I'd also point out that in section 4, where he said DOE still needed to make $1.5 million in cuts from the source of the will-hinckley funds, he does have a statement there that says the legislature had, made cuts to those task categories, but at no time did it communicate to DOE where this reduction should come from. I just want to point out that as we mentioned in the information brief, we do have emails between he and one of the governor's senior policy advisors occurring in late June that reference the fact that that money is...
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And so all of this leaves me really wondering what was going through people's heads. There was correspondence, you're saying, that indicated to the Department of Education, indicating that what should be cut was in the technology area.
There was no correspondence. We have
emails?
Emails between the commissioner and the governor's office where they're talking about what changes the legislature has made to the budget.
Mm-hmm.
And he's talking about the $1.5 million in cuts that were associated with the 30-year-old computer system.
So they're referring to that cut as being associated with technology,
right,
in correspondence between DOE and the governor's office.
Yes.
And there was no correspondence indicating that will-hinckley was part of it, nor was there any discussion of that on appropriations?
Correct.
So for me, this claim doesn't pass a straight face test.
Is that a question, Senator? I want to try to keep this moving.
That was an observation based on the
Thank
answers.
you. Any other questions for, seeing none?
All right, Mr. Moore is in the room outside, but there's not room, so when you're ready for him, let me know, I'll go ask him.
Okay, anything other preliminarily? And we'll invite Mr. Moore in. Just for those of you who might have gotten here later, after we started, there was an overflow room across the hall in the Education Committee room, probably a little cooler than it is in here. And also, for those of you who would like to speak today, there's a sign-up sheet right over here in the far corner, and we're going to generally take people according to the order that they sign up, subject to a few exceptions. So having said that, if there's nothing further, we will invite Mr. Moore to join us.